view comes with a lot of paradoxes about divine atemporality, unchangeability, which make notions of acts of God, specific acts of God, quite difficult to explain. But that's kind of rule number one. My second query would be in this conversation, because it's already come up in our pre-conversation, would be if you're wondering about acts of God in relation to cosmology or indeed evolution or neuroscience that we may get onto, are you looking for scientific evidences in today's discussion that would even persuade or start to convince a skeptic that we need some notion of God as an explanatory first cause? Or are you undergoing what many people today do instead, which is to step back from that natural theology ambition and instead talk about a notion of God that you may have derived from somewhere else already and is compatible with the scientific evidences, often called a theology of nature as opposed to a natural theology? And people who haven't decided about that before they start arguing at a dinner party are likely to get into some fruitless debates. So that's my first input. As a theologian, as a believer, I myself believe that the notion of a divine creator is entirely coherent. And I'm actually in the revived natural theology camp rather than merely the theology of nature camp. But we can come on to that later, maybe, when we get...
We can. But what you're saying would feel very comfortable even to a hard-nosed atheistic physicist, because the idea of God as being some sort of abstract, timeless supporter of nature or the laws and not a cosmic magician
exactly.
Interfering from time to time. Really, there's no contest. There's no problem. And so I'd like to see whether Keith concurs with your position on that or has a slightly different point of view.
Well, no, I would never disagree fundamentally with Sarah, but I am, as a philosopher, I'm an idealist. And that is something which really is a bit unusual these days. But it's somebody who believes that the fundamental reality of all things is mind, or is mind-like. Has thoughts and feelings and intentions. So mind is the reality we know best, and I think it's the fundamental reality, and matter is a product of mind. So that's the idealist position. And then that's when you talk about the Big Bang, you're talking about the origin of matter from mind. You're talking about how it is that mind expresses itself somehow in a material way. So I would take the view matter, material bodies, material things, the physical universe itself are expressions of spirit, of a mind-like reality, spirit or God. Hegel, one of the best known idealists, called spirit or Geist. So my position is that actually spirit is, as you say, timeless, beyond space-time as we know it, at any rate, and is expressing itself in the material universe. And I don't see why there shouldn't be more than one material universe, but whatever there are, they are expressions of spirit. So that's my fundamental position. I would be there whether I was a believer or not, really. And not all idealists call this mind God, because they sometimes don't like vicars.
But the one thing that it's really important for our audience to understand, and before we bring in George on this, that you both seem to be taking the position that if we want to use this term God, and we don't have to, but some sort of ultimate reality, it is in effect transcending space and time, and we're getting away from this notion, which so many people seem to adhere to in popular religion, of a sort of super being sitting there for all eternity, and then at some particular moment pressing a button and making the Big Bang go bang. In other words, being preceding the universe in time, there before the universe, the creator of the universe in the colloquial sense of creation. One day I decide to build a house or something. We're getting away from that. And that's really important because a lot of people, I think, are still clinging to that notion. And it's important because in a simple model of cosmology, which goes back to Einstein's general theory of relativity, the Big Bang was the origin of time. And that's an idea that was already there in the 5th century when St. Augustine said that the world was made with time and not in time. So all of this rests very easily with me, but not necessarily with people who would like God's action in the world to be on a sort of day-to-day basis. But before we get into that, I'd like to bring in George. And George and I are so old, we became cosmologists when the steady state theory of Fred Hoyle was still popular. We were both in Cambridge at the time Fred was there. The steady state theory, I need to remind you, said there was no Big Bang, there was no origin of the universe. The universe is eternal and continually replenishing, renewing itself. And so you don't have to tangle with the issue of origins. It's simply always been there. And so now the question I'm going to put to you, George, and feel free to comment on what the others have said, is our understanding of God as a timeless being affected in any way if we don't have a Big Bang, but we have a universe that's always existed, either a single universe or a multiverse of many universes? So that's a sort of complicated question. What do you have to say about that?
Well, as I worked on this issue, the start of the universe at Cambridge with Stephen Hawking and others, and Roger Penrose has just got the Nobel Prize for this. And the physics basically said, yes, that it was likely that there was a start to the universe. The steady state theory was wrong, and there was a whole interchange that took place about that. So I'm comfortable with the idea that the universe did have a start. I think it's very clear that despite what some of my physics colleagues do, physics cannot explain the start of the universe, because before the universe existed, space and time didn't exist. So if there were laws of physics, they didn't have anything to act on. So I do, as a certain level, believe in laws of physics as determining what happens. In fact, what I believe is a Platonic possibility spaces, which are the deep structure of the cosmos and which determine what is possible. I'm not a theologian, so I wouldn't express the thing in quite the same way as my other two colleagues. To me, the really deep question is, does purpose or meaning underlie the universe? And so the question there is, if there are possibility spaces which determine what happens, you can call them laws of physics if you like, but there are possibility space for physics, for biology, for thoughts, and so on. And each of these is timeless, eternal, unchanging. There are Platonic spaces determining what is possible. And to me, that's the deep structure of the cosmos, which precedes the origin of the universe. And the question is, where did those come from? And to me, it's perfectly plausible, logical, that you can think of those as being an expression of mind or purpose in some sense. I wouldn't try to be very theological about it, but I would just leave it at that kind of generic level, that yes, there is purpose or meaning underlying the universe, and it is expressed in possibility spaces which allow life to come into existence. And the deep, fundamentally difficult question which you've thought about, I've thought about, is why are the laws of physics such as to allow life to exist? That's one of the really deep questions.
Right, I'm pleased you raised that. I was going to come on to that because our audience may not realize, but let me say that the way I would express it in a lecture, that imagine if I was unhappy with the universe and I wanted to sort of play God and change a few things, and I had in front of me a designer machine with all these knobs on, and I turn this knob and make all electrons a bit heavier, and turn that knob and make the weak force a bit weaker, and so on. When you do the experiment, and it's just, of course, a thought experiment, what you find is that some of those knob settings, if you touch them by even a little amount, the possibility for any sort of life in the universe is wrecked. And so this is often called the fine-tuning argument, that the laws of the universe seem to be rigged in favor of life, to use a currently fashionable terminology. So we live in a rigged universe, and then what are we to make of that? Does that mean a designer set it up with these knob settings judiciously chosen, or does it mean that there's a vast multiplicity of universes with sort of random knob settings, and only in that tiny fraction where life is possible does it pop up, like in this one, and we think, well, this is amazing. But of course, viewed, if we take that bigger picture, it's going to happen somewhere. And this is an argument between back and forth. We're not going to resolve it here, but I want to mention, for the sake of the audience, there's been a lively discussion among the scientific community.
I've been a part of that lively discussion in which I've criticized it as being a non-scientific kind of argument, because if you assume all of these billions of other universes existed, there is no way to prove that they exist. So from my viewpoint, that is not scientific. But furthermore, this doesn't solve the problem. And what I find amazing is people think it solves it. All it does is it shifts it up one level.
Sure.
So if you say there's a multiverse which allows universes with life to exist, I respond, well, why does the multiverse be of such a nature as to allow any universes with life to exist? All you've done is shift the philosophical problem up one level, and you haven't solved it at all. It just recurs at the next level.
I agree. Sarah, would you like to comment on that?
I would actually. Well, actually, I'd like to go back to something you said at the end of, after you were responding to me first, because I think it's critical. When I express the view that if we think properly about God in a scholastic way as that without which there would be nothing, and then we don't need to have a contest between divine, continual, timeless acting and events within the universe, that doesn't or shouldn't evoke a picture in which God is having a kind of eternal tea break and doing nothing. I think what you said was that that would suggest a picture in which God isn't doing anything from day to day. That's the opposite of what a proper scholastic vision of the timeless God sustaining and loving the universe into existence at every moment conveys. In other words, it doesn't mean that God isn't doing anything here and now. Do you see what I mean?
No, it's a really important point, Sarah, though perhaps we can clarify. So there are two senses in which God might be doing something, like right now. One is keeping the whole show on the road, the universe and us in existence. And the other is, to put it bluntly, moving molecules around, that is, working little miracles or big miracles, and changing the course of events on a day-to-day basis. I think most Christians, at least in the popular religion, believe the latter. To scientists, that's very problematic.
Well, it's not completely problematic if you allow for what George calls these Platonic, what do you call them, George?
Possibility spaces.
Yes, possibility spaces. In other words, I think, post-Einsteinian physics has allowed us to perceive the possibility of fluidity here, not as God of the gaps, not as God desperately trying to find a place where he can still get in, as it were, but as the undergirding sustainer of all, constantly, as it were, interacting timelessly with the time to allow for the possibility of transformations. Not that we can, as it were, necessarily pin them down, because it seems to me that rather rarely is there a moment that we could say that God absolutely performs a miracle in the sense that Thomas Aquinas would call it a miracle, that is, when only God and only God is acting, not acting through the secondary causations of universal laws or human actions. One example might be the resurrection of Jesus Christ, if you believe it.
Right. Keith, would you like to
there's
discussion?
There's a slight complication, and this may be my idiosyncratic view, but I think that God, of course, our space-time had a beginning, no problems, but I think there are many different sorts of time, and the two relevant sorts here are space-time like ours, where time and space are correlative, but there's also time, as Aristotle put it, time as the measure of change. So there's a sort of what we might call mental or psychological time, if you have one thought after another. That doesn't have to be in space-time. It is just, there's a change, and that's a sort of time. And there's a sense in which I would want to say, well, God is truly beyond our space-time. And in many ways, God is beyond change and time altogether. But there are other respects in which God does change. So there is change in God. And I would say God is such that there is an eternal, changeless aspect to God and a temporal aspect. And the temporal expresses the eternal. Can I use my favorite analogy? I could say, I eternally, it's not quite true, but I eternally, changelessly love my wife. Well, perhaps not true, but I changelessly love my wife. But when I express my love, I do different things, wash the dishes sometimes, or I might do something. So I express my eternal, changeless disposition in particular temporal acts. So I want to say that God can do that. And I don't want to talk about miracles particularly. I just think that there's just as we act in ways which we can't fully understand to change things. We don't talk about ourselves doing miracles, but we know we cause changes in the physical world. And in some way, the mind of the cosmos, that's my view of God, will be sharing in causing changes in the physical world, but we don't know how to explain that fully any more than we can explain how my intentions cause changes. So what I'm saying is God has eternal purposes, goals, intentions for the universe, and these are played out in particular acts, which, and again, I like Aristotle here, which attract, function as attractors to the way things go, but are not really moving molecules about in that sense. They're not pushing molecules around. They're attracting beings within the universe to move in a certain direction towards love and intelligence, perhaps. Does that make sense? So,
just to sort of summarize the drift of this discussion, because I'd like to move on to other topics. It seems that God's relation to time is a subtle one, and there are going to be some people who would want to ask questions like, well, which reference frame is God's time relative to ours, and all those sorts of things. Maybe we simply lack the right conceptual framework for expressing what we're all sort of groping towards here, which is somehow to have an abstract notion of God which is still relevant to day life, and we're sort of casting around how to do that. But there's one thing that I think we will all agree on, and that is that Stephen Hawking got it wrong when he said the following. I'm going to quote from a book of his. He says, I think the universe was spontaneously created out of nothing. Well, maybe, according to the laws of science. Now, this is the point. If you accept, as I do, that the laws of nature are fixed, then it doesn't take long to ask, what role is there for God? And so Steve and I had this very naive view that if the laws explain the universe, well, then God's sort of redundant. But we've been very much looking at a notion of God as the ground of being, or the rational ground in which the laws of physics are rooted. We talked a bit about picking the right sorts of laws and so on. And this sort of timeless holding into being. And so Stephen has knocked on the head, we might think, an old-fashioned theology, an old-fashioned view of God as the cosmic magician, the super being, creating the universe and then dabbling in it from time to time. We don't need the dabbler, but this more abstract notion seems to be a very powerful one. And whether it can be made philosophically coherent does interest me. We may come back to that at the end. In other words, people always want to ask, well, who made God? Where does the explanatory chain end? And if you're going to posit that there is some ultimate explanation, whatever we call it, and we could want a better word, call it God, is that a sort of self-explanatory, self-sustaining concept? I'd like to come back to that if we have time, but because we're anxious also to talk about life as well as the universe, and the everything can come later, I'd like to now raise the subject of life's origin, we know life on Earth could be traced back 3.5 billion years. And the opinion about how did life come to exist has sort of changed over the years. So when I was a student, the point of view about life's origin was well expressed by Jacques Monod, who said somewhat sexistly, "Man at last knows he is alone in the universe, out of which he emerged only by chance, and the ancient covenant is in pieces." And in other words, he said life is a stupendous accident of no significance, cosmic significance at all. Francis Crick, a much more cheerful and colourful figure, but also a committed atheist, said life seemed almost a miracle, so many of the conditions for it to get going. But now the pendulum has swung, and it's fashionable to say that the universe is teeming with life, that life is sort of built into the laws of the universe. The universe is rigged, as I've used that expression, in favour of life. So that seems to be the current view. So what we've got on offer is either incredibly improbable accident, law-like inevitability, or a miracle, divine intervention, those three. Now that gets life going, and then of course it has to evolve from that point on. But before we come on to evolution, let me just ask you three other panelists about what you feel about which of those three, or do you have a fourth, about the origin of life, if you have an opinion at all. Maybe we'll start with George on that one. How did life get going? Did it need a miracle? Was it an accident?
I think the laws of physics are tuned to allow life to come into existence. Why that is, we don't know, but we do know that is true. And the kind of life that come into existence is highly constrained. And there's a wonderful book by Andreas Wagner talking about the possibility spaces for life. It's really one of the great books in evolution. And I know you've thought about this in more depth than I, so I think it's difficult to say the precise trajectory how life come into existence. You've got to get the information going on the other hand and the metabolism going on the other hand in some kind of combination, and we don't know. Nevertheless, I don't think there's a problem in principle. I think that's something that we will solve eventually. And I want to contrast that one of the great, there are these great evolutionary steps, and one of them is the coming into being of consciousness, and I think that one is a very, very difficult one, the coming into being of qualia, and I think that's a really difficult one.
It will come into being when we get onto it, but we've started with life's origin a long time ago. Still lost in the mists of time as to the specifics, but once life gets going, we have Darwin's theory of evolution. I've got this lovely quote which I often use to segue from physics to cosmology. It's at the end of his book, his famous book. He says, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. And here he summarizes brilliantly the difference between the physicist's view of the world of sort of fixed, wonderful laws, everything in accordance with that, and this sort of open-ended, evolving creativity that we associate with evolution. So Sarah, this is something I know you've thought about a lot. If somebody says, well, life is wonderful, and we would all agree with that, can we find evidence for God in biology, in evolution, in this wonderful story of life? How do you respond to that? Imagine the dinner party.
Yeah, the dinner party. Well, the problem here, at least in the last few decades, has been that evolutionary theory has been covertly front-loaded with a particular metaphysic, which is not obviously demanded by the evolutionary science itself. And so we have been subject to a new genomic story about genetic selfishness and complete randomness within evolution, which seems seriously to undercut the idea of the play of divine beauty and order within evolution. But I think this is a paradigm that I'm going to stick my neck out here. I think this is a paradigm that is foundering. And I think it's foundering under the impact of the most interesting developments in mathematical evolutionary thinking. In fact, the point at which I think evolutionary thinking is seeking to link itself to physics and linking itself to the mathematical regularities of the universe. And as you know, I wrote my Gifford lectures on this because I'm fascinated by the increasing evidences that the story of pervasive, destructive, bloody selfishness, in which, you know, every item is out for itself, and that is the sole narrative of evolution, is really undercut once we begin to understand mathematically the countervailing story of evolutionary cooperation, in the technical sense of cooperation here, which doesn't just mean collaboration. It means activities within evolutionary populations which are sacrificial for some, as it were, for the sake of the whole population. That's already, to introduce anthropomorphic language, slightly improper to a population, say, of bacteria. But what we now understand is that if so-called selfish choices were the sole choices deemed to be successful, that would be undercutting to the flourishing of a population in time. And Darwin himself already had intuitions about this in his last book. He couldn't explain them. But in The Descent of Man, in a famous passage, he was able to see that what he called sacrifice was part of evolution, but he couldn't quite, as it were, relate it to the other part of his theory. So this is not a story about everything being fine now. It's not a great lurch towards saying that there's no competition or destructiveness or violence within the evolutionary story. Of course, that is there. But I think we're beginning to understand, partly through the application of game theory, when loosed from its kind of very short-term utilitarian economic overtones, is that we have a picture of evolution in which there are regularities. And in which there's a kind of beauty of regularity in the whole span of evolutionary development.
What you're explaining is very much my view of what I call the new biology, and this involves cooperation, altruism, and so on, and the selective value of that. But I suppose what I'm after here from this discussion is it's back to this idea of teleology, of goal-oriented processes in nature. Is the universe about something? Is it for something? Is it going towards something? And if we look at evolution, a lot of people say, oh, well, life started out some miserable sludge, and look now, it's all sort of wonderful, this exuberance. But I'm going to put to George, because he's raised this idea of possibility spaces, that is, as Stephen Jay Gould often maintained, that life is nothing more than an exploration, a random exploration of possibilities, and we reconstruct a narrative. Here we are now, we look back and we think, well, how did we get here? We reconstruct a narrative as if we were, as it were, preordained. Life is just blundering around at random. Or is this not so much, it might be blundering around a bit, is it not so much at random? Is it in some sense pre-configured, in which things like the emergence of mind and morality, concepts that we obviously want to get onto if we have time, are somehow built into the very nature of the process. So, George.
Firstly, I think it's completely right that the idea of evolution as just being competition is simply totally wrong. We like to phrase it now that evolution is cooperation modulated by competition, because take your own body, for example, your 10 to the 13th cells acting as a cooperative group, and those cells die if they're pulled out of the group. They depend for their existence on the group. So there's a huge amount of cooperation going on. But what happens then, and many people have pointed out, is that in the possibility space for life, there are attractors, and the attractors result in convergent evolution, the same kinds of stuff coming up all over the place, because there are only certain particular ways that you can solve problems. So there's a lot of randomness in what happens, but they lead to very, very similar outcomes. precisely because there are attractors in the possibility space.
George, some of people in the audience may not know what an attractor is. Could you give her just a brief description?
There's a whole set of possibilities, and you can start off in all sorts of places in terms of the initial conditions. You can start off with all sorts of configurations, but they all end up in pretty much the same kind of endpoint. Because, for instance, if the animal's there and they're going to try to survive, it's really good for them to have eyes, and it doesn't matter how they get there, but you can pretty much predict, because light exists, animals are going to end up having eyes given sufficient time. So that's
and indeed, eyes have evolved many, many times independently. So that's one good way of deciding, you know, what is an attractor, eyes and wings. But it leads me, and we must bring Keith in on this. It leads me to ask a question that I've long struggled with, because it connects to the possibility of extraterrestrial beings and so on. That if you say, well, what's so special about humans? Well, we think, well, we're the smartest people on the planet, you know, it's our intelligence. Then the question is the evolution of intelligence like the evolution of eyes or wings? In other words, sort of inevitable, given that it's advantageous? Or is it, as my friend Charlie Lineweaver often says, it's just like the elephant's trunk? You know, elephants probably think trunks are really important, wonderful things, and they're the best species on the planet for it. But you wouldn't expect, if you reran the tape, to see trunks emerging. So is intelligence eye-like, or is it trunk-like? And that's really important, I think, for getting at the bottom of, is there a scheme of things in which the emergence of mind and consciousness and comprehension and so on are built into the nature of the universe? Which is what I'd like to believe. I think I do believe. I do want to hear from Keith on that topic as well. But George, as I interrupted you, do you want to just?
I would say that intelligence is basically inevitable. It's possible, and your survival chances are so much better when you can plan ahead. You can decide what to do. You can work out the consequences. You can. I think that intelligence is inevitable. But what is very important, and it's something we need to come to eventually, is that this intelligence must be guided by values. And so we need to come to that in due course.
We will come to that, and I've got one eye on the clock. I think we're going to have time for that. But Keith,
I'm
so
going
life
to
is out there. Is ET going to be out there too?
Yeah, I think value is the important question. Value and purpose are very much connected, because if you say there's a purpose in a process, you're thinking that it's moving towards something of value. So you have to ask, what is there worth valuing? Are there intrinsic values, things which are good in themselves, which you would want to say it's better that they exist than not? And if you ask that question and you say, what are the biggest values we can think of, not just in human beings, but anywhere at all, I think you would come up with things like love, personal relationship, trust, fidelity, honesty, and moral freedom. Happiness, of course, would be one of them. I mean, there are things that would be reasonable for any conscious being to wish to have, and those will be values. So in asking the question about purpose, you're asking, does the universe look as though it's moving towards the realization of value, of intrinsic values, of things which are worthwhile in themselves? And I just quote Julian Huxley, who is no lover of religion as a biologist, and he said, well, when you look at from the beginning of the universe to now, you have to say you start with something unconscious, purposeless, without value, with hardly any properties at all. You move to conscious, communal, possibly loving entities, not necessarily humans, but beings of some sort. If you can't call that an increase in value, well, what can you call an increase in value? It just looks obvious to anyone, really, who thinks, oh, from the Big Bang to here, there's been an increase in value. Right? There might have been an increase in disvalue too, but let's just concentrate on the value. And you say, well, if this goes on, you're going to get an increase in intelligence and also in the properties of being able to relate lovingly to other people. And those are things which ought to exist, and which it's possible they're in the possibility space of this universe. And I would think to a person like me, without going into biological details, I know biologists in Oxford go frothing at the mouth if you talk about purpose in evolution, and they say, well, everything's an accident, especially you. And I think, well, if you look at the Big Bang and then communities of intelligent, loving beings, and to the future of an increase in those properties of the universe becoming self-aware and self-directing, I mean, that's just an enormous increase in value, which couldn't exist without consciousness. It doesn't have to be human. I hate the thought that it's got to be human, but it does have to be personal. So it has to be mind. It's the realization of valued minds in a universe which points to its being grounded in a mind of supreme value. So I think that's the key term. Value is connected with purpose.
Right. Yeah. Now, so you raised a subject there that I keep banging on about, and which has been bypassed largely in this discussion, that we think of value as morality, intelligence, and so on. But there's one thing that for me as a scientist absolutely stands out, and I keep on and on and on about this because I think this is the key to everything, that humans are more than just moral, intelligent creatures. Humans are comprehending creatures. We can understand the universe through science and mathematics. We can do this amazing thing. Most of us can do this amazing thing called mathematics. Some people say, I'm hopeless at it, just haven't tried hard enough. The truth is that the human brain has evolved for reasons that I find utterly mysterious. It evolved to survive in the proverbial jungle, and yet we have the capacity to use abstract mathematics and arcane reasoning through scientific exploration to decode the subtext, the cosmic code, if you like, in which the laws of nature are written. So when Newton saw the falling apple, he didn't just see a falling apple like a bird or a dog might have seen the same thing. He connected the motion of the apple to the motion of the moon. That abstract, deep mathematical structure that humans are capable of decoding, I think is something of enormous significance. So when people say to me, well, is there a meaning or purpose in the universe? So those are loaded terms. What I say is that there is a scheme of things in which not just life, not just mind, but comprehension come into the picture. So a subset of the universe has the ability to grasp the whole thing. I think that's deeply, deeply significant. Now, I'm just expressing a personal opinion, but I would certainly like to hear the responses of the rest of you to that point of view.
I would just say, Paul, scientists are committed to the supreme self-sacrificing value of truth. Truth at any price, almost. And I find it deeply strange when people like Steven Weinberg say the more he knows about the cosmology, the more meaningless it gets, when his whole life is devoted to finding out the truth about the universe, which is an amazing thing.
Yeah, you can't be a scientist without believing, I say, and I've used this before, this term, as an act of faith, but that gets me into trouble, believing that, first of all, the universe is ordered in a rational manner. If you thought it was meaningless, you wouldn't even bother to be a scientist. And secondly, that human beings have the capacity to uncover that order, maybe only partially, but we're doing pretty well, I have to say. And I think this is enormously significant. And that's the starting point of science. So in a sense, you can't be a scientist without having, as an act of faith, to believe in those features of the universe. So that's when I talk about a scheme of things, that is the scheme I'm talking about.
I think this conversation has been, yes, exactly. I think this conversation has been very useful in showing that it's often a red herring to dangle the word teleology too quickly in front of a scientist, because for them it means back to Paley. And instead, what we need to look at is various arenas of scientific endeavor in which some kind of notion of purposiveness or order or structure, whether it be evolutionary convergence or the mysterious emergence of life, or the existence of morality in human consciousness, these are all so fascinating that they should at least induce some wonder. And, you know, it's a separate question whether what they contribute to is an argument for God's existence. That seems to me to be a separate and later point. But the existence of something that it's very hard not to call something like teleology. I know biologists prefer teleonomy, but that strikes me as a bit of a sort of facade, actually. We're in the same territory, right?
Right. The T word must be used advisedly, but I'd like to bring in George at this point, because I know you have a particular point of view that when we come on to things like mind, consciousness, if you like, you're going beyond intelligence. You think there's the rules of the game change. There's something rather special about that step. Would you like to explain?
Well, firstly, teleology is central to developmental biology, and in fact, our common friend Michael Levin has written wonderfully about this.
Yeah.
And you can't have developmental biology without teleology, and I think that's just a fact about the way it is. Once you've got the brain, you've got teleology. There's not the slightest question about it, that the thoughts have causal powers, we have purposes in our life, and so on. Teleology is all over the place, and to deny it is just madness. Who built the Large Hadron Collider? Why does it exist? It's because of teleology. But the question, the underlying one, which still is this issue of values, and I'm a moral realist, and so in these spaces, these possibility spaces, there's a space of values, of possible values, and you can have values which are very self-centered, or you can have values in which you are very generous, you're doing everything on behalf of the other. And the question is there a preferred set of values out there? And I believe that there is. I believe in moral realism that there are preferred values. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. It underlies the existence of a moral life, and it cannot be proved in any physical sense by science or anything. But I think that we must believe in it if we believe in a moral life.
Could I raise another subject connected with this? I don't know if everyone's experiencing the same sort of screen mayhem that I'm looking at, but my screen is doing weird things. But I shall soldier on nonetheless. Pauline mentioned it in her introduction about the realization that Homo sapiens is just one of many Homo species that have been on this planet. Unfortunately, all the others seem to have vanished. And this raises the whole question of what it means to be human. Now, we've been talking rather abstract terms about intelligence, mind, comprehension, and so on. We have no idea whether Neanderthals comprehended their world or what was going on in their heads. But it does raise this whole question about what does it mean to be human. And in religion, pretty much all the world's religions, but Christianity especially, seem to be rooted in humanity. The notion of salvation in Christianity, who gets to be saved? Well, it's humans who get to be saved. But the definition of human has become broader or more problematic. Is that a threat to Christianity? And it goes hand in hand with the other question I was going to ask, that if there are advanced extraterrestrial beings, not just technologically and scientifically more advanced than us, but maybe ethically more advanced, maybe a planet of saintly beings out there that have put all their squabbles behind. Is that a problem for salvation?
No, Christians
uniqueness of the incarnation. I keep putting this out there to my theologian friends. I get many different answers. So could I put that to Keith and Sarah?
Yes. Christians have always believed there are extraterrestrial intelligent beings by the million, angels. And they're called angels.
Oh, them. Right.
But it's not true. It's not true that humans are the only intelligent spiritual beings in the universe. It never has been true for a Christian. And the fact we put them now on other planets or exoplanets, well, that's just a new development of the old idea. And I personally would rather talk about personal beings rather than human beings, and say what counts is the development of consciousness and the things that go along with that, the concern for truth and beauty and goodness. And of course, as an idealist, I think, well, everything is mind anyway. So you're going to go a long way down the evolutionary trail before you get to something which is mindless, by which we mean its level of consciousness is, well, it's not conscious, but it has an inner life which doesn't rise to the level of consciousness. So I think humans, a lot of Christians have, it's true, made the mistake that only humans are the objects of God's concern. But that's probably because only humans need saving. Everybody else is all right. Okay. So
could I put that to Sarah? That,
yes, absolutely.
That, about the incarnation, that, you know, Christians believe that God became human, took on human flesh to save humankind. And as our old friend John Polkinghorne put it, that he didn't take on little green flesh to save the proverbial little green men.
Does John know that?
It's been a problem. No, we don't know that. But the multiplicity of incarnations is a heresy in some branches of Christianity. So this is a whole tangle of stuff that I'm fascinated by.
That's not true. Thomas Aquinas, can I just say this? One sentence, Sarah, just one sentence. Thomas Aquinas said, could there be more than one incarnation? And he answered, yes, there could. That's
right. I think the problem here is that we are overly dominated by the story of creation, in which, you know, Adam takes dominion over all the other creatures, and therefore and is made in the image of God, and so on. But that doesn't rule out the possibility in the great vision that we see in Paul's thinking, that the whole cosmos is, this is Romans 8, is wrought in the extended image of God, and is affected by the sin of the human, and is groaning along with the human towards completion in Christ. So there's a minority report within Christianity that actually sees the whole evolution and the whole cosmos as implicated in God's designs, including the matter of salvation through Christ. That's the one that I would want to push forward now. It certainly hasn't been the core perspective. And like Keith, I see no problem in this vision being extended towards extraterrestrial life.
So if ET makes contact tomorrow, you wouldn't be it wouldn't change your faith?
Not my theological perspective. I might have some trouble with ET. It might be a little alarming. The one thing we haven't mentioned here, and it's a major omission, is that little problem of sin. I mean, that is what distinguishes the human. And it's why the human has both the greatest capacity for cooperation, transformation, moral superiority, and also the worst capacity. It's like, you know, as evolution opens up into the human, we have the most destructive capacities at our fingertips, as we're now observing in the ecological crisis, as well as the most cooperative with God's design. So that, I think, has to be taken into the picture, and whether we'll find that ET has had a fall will be very interesting.
Well, now let me put a question that I love putting. I put it to a panel yesterday, actually, in the same conference, but didn't get an answer. And it's a sort of mischievous question, but given our ability to do gene editing, and this is very naive, but supposing we could edit the human genome to remove sort of grossly evil or antisocial behavior, should we do that? Or is our capacity to be evil and bad part of what makes us human and therefore good? In other words, we should preserve human fallibility, even though we may have the scientific tools to remove it. It's an interesting sort of ethical dilemma.
Yes.
Do you have an answer to that? Or,
are you asking me, or are you?
Yeah, well, I think you and Keith.
Well,
you know, is it?
You're asking Sarah, I think.
You'd be out of a job. You know, if humanity was full of saintly beings, priests would no longer be needed, would they?
Well, that would be fine.
There are demons too.
I mean, my interpretation of the fall and of the nature of sin is that it is both and at the same time a fall into a devastating capacity for destructiveness and blindness, and a miraculous capacity for collaboration and cooperation with God. So I read it rather differently from Augustine. The early Greek fathers read the fall as a fall into freedom. It's Augustine who reads it as a fall into total depravity. So this would be a much longer conversation about how to interpret.
And we've got to bring in the audience at some stage soon, but I did want to ask George, because you're a Quaker, and I don't know what the Quakers feel about these issues. For example, extraterrestrial life. Do they have any? Is there any sort of position?
The Quakers avoid dogma. The Quaker view on a lot of this, so I'm a bit different from our other friends here, is that when you're talking about the this kind of thing, the super stuff, you're dealing with things which we cannot understand, and any attempt to contain the supernatural, the transcendent within words, within human thoughts, is always going to be fallible. It's going to mislead us as much as it's going to lead us in the right direction. And so we try to avoid theological
Speculation.
They're going to be just as misleading as they're going to be helpful. And so we try to be very open-minded about this and not take dogmatic positions on any of these kinds of things. We believe in an openness of thought which doesn't try to tie it down too much.
Well, I believe in that too, George, but I just think most of you are wrong.
We've got questions popping up on the screen, but I'm going to hand over to the boss, Pauline, who I think has been keeping her eye on the questions and might be able to read one or two out.
Well, yes, I mean, I've been enjoying the conversation so much, I just didn't want to disturb you. But yeah, it's true, we have got lots of questions coming in. So I want to start with this one. Does God have a sense of humor?
I remember asking my father that at the age of about 7, and he said, "Well, I should think so." But what do the other panelists think?
Certainly, he's Jewish.
Well, I guess the question itself is humorous, but perhaps we should move on to the next one.
I think it's our ideas of God must be put with a sense of humor because we know so little about it. So a little bit of humility goes with a little bit of humor, maybe.
Or we can actually pass on to a more serious question. So when considering the future of the universe, i.e. thermodynamic death and decomposition of complex structures, it seems that man, in brackets, intelligence and values, is only a transitional phenomenon. At the end, there are no intelligent beings left, nor values left. What do you think about this?
Good question. And I hoped we would be able to talk about the end of the universe at some stage. And I've written whole books on this, so I'm going to keep quiet because I could talk all day.
Well, as an old man, Paul, I can say that I'm subject to the law of entropy in quite a big way. But I've had a great life, and I'm glad I had it. And there was a lot of point in it. There was a lot of meaning, a lot of value, a lot of purpose. And I shall die happy. But I shall die. But what's the problem?
Well, the question is whether the whole universe is in some sense going to die. And
yeah, that's okay.
A vast subject. But Bertrand Russell, who of course celebrated his atheism, drew upon the second law of thermodynamics in support of his view of the pointlessness and hopelessness of existence.
Yeah, but that's silly. We're all dying, and that doesn't make life pointless.
I should reassure the audience that the universe won't die anytime soon, unless there's a terrible accident. But if it just is the thermodynamic heat death, there are trillions of years ahead. But the question is, I think in some people's minds that they sort of feel, well, if something like life and mind can endure forever and ever, maybe that gives more significance to our fleeting existence now. It's an open scientific question as to whether that is the case. But George, as a cosmologist, I mean, you've thought, of course, a lot about infinite universes and the end of the universe.
From a cosmology viewpoint, there are other possibilities, but I think the general likelihood is that the universe will expand forever. Galaxies will die out, stars will die out, life will die out, and it will turn out in the end that the period of life in the universe is a transitory event. I think that is likely to be the, from a scientific viewpoint, the situation. From a theological viewpoint, you can make what you like of that, but I think from the science, I think that is the situation.
Right. So, Sarah, do you have? Would it bother you if the universe ends either with a big crunch where it just all goes out of existence, or worse still, an infinite period of essentially nothingness?
Well, here I actually agree strongly with Keith, even though I haven't agreed with him on everything that he said this afternoon, because if you start with the perception of the divine as this transcendent creator and sustainer, there is nothing that can happen, albeit the dissolution of life and of the cosmos as we know it, which undermines God. All right. And if you've placed all your hopes in God, then by definition, God is that will endure. This is where I separate myself from, say, a process view or some kind of kenotic view in which God is sort of bound up with the universe in such a way that it will change God. This is a place where I separate myself from Keith as well, as you will notice from his earlier views about divine changefulness. I don't think that God does change.
Well, in case people are getting depressed at this idea of a sort of infinite lingering heat death of the universe, the multiverse theory that we touched on has many bangs scattered throughout space and time. And whilst what we call the universe, we use that term, is really only just a fragment in this vast multiverse, whilst this universe might have a birth, evolutionary phase and a death, the multiverse is eternal. So there are always universes somewhere popping up, creating life anew, mind anew, and so on. So you get the best of both worlds. You get the old steady state idea of continual replenishment, but then you have a cycle. But Keith, you don't like that.
That's not good because it's not you. I mean, you say, oh, something's got to go on in 1 billion years, but it's nothing to do with me. I mean, who cares? Really?
Well, unless we go down the path of duplicate beings, and I think that's we don't want to go down that's a topic too far for this this brief conversation.
Let me stick in a word for the change in God, because here's where Sarah and I can have a good argument. But I think that God changes in this way, that every experience that we have is taken into God. And it is there transfigured into something wholly good and free of evil and frustration. And it is possible that we, when we die, will be able to share in that divine experience. So that's what I really think. I think if, our hope, the human hope, if it's a hope at all, it's not for this universe going on and on forever. It's for there being some state of being possible, I think Christians believe in it really, where we will have access to a greater life and a greater knowledge and share in the nature of God. However exactly you work that out, that's a hope which isn't bound up with the death of this universe. So I don't hope for this universe going on forever at all.
Pauline, give us another question.
Yes, another question. Well, I've got to take one from Barbara Temple, a very loyal young teenager, I know. So she's got a couple, but let's go. If the Big Bang is the beginning of time, does the word before have any meaning?
Can I take that one? Yes, this is a very subtle point, a really important one. Thanks, Barbara. Because people talk about causation and they talk about explanation. So if in the old-fashioned sense of the word cause, you might have said, well, God caused the Big Bang because God was there in time before the Big Bang and caused it to happen in the usual sense of cause and effect, the effect following the cause. But I think we've convinced ourselves we don't like that idea, that notion of God. And so the question then is, can we explain the Big Bang in terms of some deeper level even in the sense of bringing into being time. And that I think is the appropriate way of looking at it. But would the other panelists like to answer that question?
I would agree with that and say, I would just agree with that and say that Barbara's quite right to question whether you can use the word before if it's out of time, and that's right. And we have to do some very paradoxical thinking to reflect on a timeless entity who is able to cause something in time. And
something can be logically prior without being temporally
prior. Exactly.
That's the way I see it.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Pauline, was there a second question from Barbara?
Well, the second question is, I think it was partly answered. Did God write the laws of physics?
Yes. Well, I think we're all moving to that sort of model of God in which the laws of physics are rooted in this deeper level. Yeah. And writing, again, sounds like something you do in time, and this is a rather timeless thing. And we struggle. I mean, in case the audience has tuned out and thinks, what are they talking about, these people? We do struggle. When dealing with these ultimate questions of existence, we come equipped with certain concepts. Some of these are biologically selected, our cognitive architecture. Some of them are culturally selected. And we really struggle to make sense of it. And maybe in 100 years or 1,000 years, people will recast these questions in a different conceptual framework. Just like we can use quantum mechanics now to talk about atoms, would have meant nothing to people 500 years ago. Maybe we can look forward to a future in which we would simply restate some of the things we're struggling with, and we wouldn't have such difficulty grappling with the issues that are going on. But I'm talking too much. Should we have another question, Pauline?
Yes, and this one is actually for George. Does the possibility space expand, and can it ever shrink?
The possibility spaces are abstract spaces, and I could spend a whole long time talking about them.
I don't think you have time, George.
I don't have the time, but they are static, eternal, unchanging. One of the underlying things about physics is that in cosmology, we assume the laws of physics are the same everywhere at all time, all places. Otherwise, we simply can't predict anything because anything can happen. And occasionally you have a law of physics in which something changes, like the gravitational constant changes, but then you always bring in a higher level law, which is an unchanging eternal law. So these are abstract spaces of possibilities, and they don't change or shrink or anything with time. For instance, one of the favorite ones of mine in terms of biology is the space of all possible proteins, which is an absolutely wonderful space. That is fixed for all times. The space of all possible proteins is fixed by the laws of physics. It doesn't change. It was the same in the very early universe. It always will be the same.
But George, you must admit that in biology, the possibility space expands when you have evolutionary innovation. So once you've got wings, you have the possibility of flight. It wasn't there before. So it does expand.
What is possible depends on the context at the particular time, and as the context changes, you can explore more the larger or smaller parts. So, for instance, in the early universe, you couldn't explore the part of the possibility space that depended on oxygen because there wasn't an oxygen atmosphere. And it came, and you could then explore the part of the possibility space that involved oxygen.
Okay, I think we should move on because we've got a few more questions.
Yes, and we've only got a few minutes.
Yes. So if there is no free will, it would seem that a god or God would have a hard time affecting behavior. So does the belief in God necessarily lead to the notion of free will? I think we should direct this one to Sarah.
Okay. Well, you could have a notion of God who created a lot of automata and just pushed them around. That's, intrinsically possible, but not very interesting. And I suppose it's the great mystery of the story of the emergence of consciousness and of free will to ask the question whether that undermines the possibility of God's existence, because we make such a mess of things that many people argue that the problem of evil actually devalues and makes it less likely that God exists, or whether the supreme value of human freedom is such that it gives more substance to our belief in God as creating us in some sense in his image, able to discern between good and evil. And much depends here, frankly, on how you understand the relationship between human free acts and divine acts and providence. And we haven't been onto that one yet, and we haven't got much time, but just so that I want to make this clear, there's a great split in modern philosophy of religion between those who believe that human freedom has a kind of aseity to it, which means that God has to get out of the way in order for humans to be free, which I think ultimately defeats itself actually as an argument, or whether you have the more classic view, again associated with people like Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, that our freedom expands insofar as we more deeply allow ourselves to be guided by divine providence and divine grace. That's a big divide in modern philosophy of religion, a huge divide.
George, did you want to make a point?
Yes, from my viewpoint, this is an absolutely key thing in the science and religion issue, is the scientific question: does physics allow us to have free will? Having long debates with various people like Martin Rees about this is crucial. If physics doesn't allow us to have free will, then at a certain level, it seems like moral responsibility isn't even possible. I believe it is possible, and in order to deal with this, I have to go, I think, and introduce all of the Platonic forms of causation, the four Platonic forms. My mind is going.
Well, formal cause, efficient cause.
Yes, that's right. You have to introduce all of those kinds of causes, and then free
Also
will.
final.
Yes.
That's right.
The T word again.
But that's an entire big discussion. But to me, this is, from the scientific viewpoint, the one place where there is a serious problem for the science-religion debate. I think it can be solved, but I think it's a really important point for debate.
And people hold entire conferences on questions of physics and free will and what do you even mean by that. And we can't, because we're running out of time, we can't go too far into it. Could I just ask, though, am I not right that the Calvinist Christian tradition did have take away free will and had everything sort of fixed in advance? Is that right, or did I?
They wouldn't say that, no. They would say that free will is compatible with being determined either by God or by laws of nature.
Right.
That's a very widely held view with which I strongly disagree.
Right. Pauline, have we got time for one more? We've just got like 1 minute.
Do aliens need saving? In other words, do they have original sin?
We've got to meet them first to see what they're like.
I've thought about this a lot. It's great. It's great fun to think about. I raised earlier the idea of editing out evil from the human genome so that we will all become saints and priests would be redundant. Even if we don't want to do that, maybe there are alien beings who have simply got beyond the point where they need to be saved. If salvation simply means rescuing from sin, if it means something more profound, then I guess they need saving as much as anybody. But quite what the mechanism would be, we can only speculate. These are very fun topics. I sort of fear that if we're to keep to the clock, we should probably call it a day.
No, we've got time for a comment from Keith on this very
comment from Keith.
The saving of extraterrestrials. I mean, salvation. I think there's too much talk about salvation in Christianity, really. And there's medieval debates about would God have become incarnate even if nobody had ever sinned? And of course, then and now, people disagree about that. I think that as Sarah put it very well, in a sense, the whole universe is an incarnation of God, or as I would put it, an expression of the mind of God. And it's no surprise if there are particular finite bits of the universe which express God more clearly and more definitively. And I expect God, I expect God, I will tell God tonight that I expect him to make himself clearly known to all the extraterrestrials there are in some form, and he'll know whether they need saving or not.
Well, that's a wonderful place, I think, to finish. We never got around to talking about necessary beings, but we'll save that for next time.
And there's no time, unfortunately. It'll have to be another conversation. So that's all the time we have, I'm afraid. So it just remains for me to thank our wonderful speakers, and a virtual round of applause for Paul Davies, Sarah Coakley, George Ellis, and Keith Ward. And of course, you, the audience, and thank you so much for watching and for your questions. I'm Pauline Davies.